Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everyone. Almost exactly 7 years ago, in May 2017, if I'm doing my math right, my guest today, Alex Edmans, made an interesting TEDx speech entitled What to Trust in a Post-Truth World. Interestingly enough, it's not who to trust, but what to trust. It's garnered almost 2 million views, which is pretty good. Some TED speeches get more, but many get less. Very influential TEDx speech. And it seems to have grown into a book. Many TEDx speeches, especially the popular ones, grow into books. It's taken 7 years, and the book is entitled May Contain Lies: How Stories, Statistics, and Studies Exploit Our Biases and What We Can Do About It. Alex is joining us from Wimbledon. His day job is at the London Business School in central London. Alex, that TED speech, what to trust in a post-truth world. It was a good speech. Were you surprised with the amount of attention it got?
I was pleasantly surprised, but also quite gratified. So, normally, when you give a TED or TEDx talk, you speak about your research. So, for me, that would be a specific paper on finance and economics, and that might only be interesting to a finance and economics audience. But this idea of misinformation, that's a concern not only in my field, but many different fields. It could be politics, science, health advice, even parenting, even how to lose weight or improve your fitness. And so, that broad appeal might be why that talk was picked up by so many people.
There's this term, I have to admit, I don't really understand what it means. Perhaps you can help me define it. What is a post-truth world? Who came up with that term, and what does it mean?
I don't know who came up with it, but I know that the Oxford Dictionaries voted it the word of the year in 2016. So, what does the word actually mean? It means when what gets circulated and what gets believed is not what is true, but what people want to be true. So, why does something go viral? It's because of its appeal, not because of its accuracy.
I wonder, though, Alex, I mean, you're not a historian, you're a business school professor, but in the history of our species is really a history of quote unquote post-truth. The vast majority of the stuff we've circulated amongst ourselves through books, broadcasts, or whatever are lies or inventions or forms of one kind of propaganda or another. Why have we suddenly landed on this idea of post-truth?
Well, certainly the idea of misinformation, as you say, Andrew, is not new. There has been a lot of misinformation spread in the past, but sometimes that misinformation is because we did not know the truth. So if people thought the world was flat, that might be before some evidence suggesting that it was round. If people thought smoking was good for your health, that might be before some information came out suggesting that it's actually harmful. So that issue still has existed in the past, but what is different nowadays is I think these post-truths can be spread by lots of people. So maybe in the past, if you were influential, you could peddle a particular narrative about smoking if you're a large tobacco company. Nowadays, it can be that somebody, just the person on the street, can peddle a particular conspiracy theory. And if this is something which plays into people's popular belief, then that will spread more easily. So it's the fact that most people, even the person on the street, can now get a platform, be this on social media or elsewhere. That's what allows misinformation to be particularly problematic.
You use this term, Alex, people on the street. It's a British term. I'm not sure. In America, we don't really have streets, so I'm not sure. And when you go into the city, there aren't any people on the street. So, but we know what you mean.
Yeah.
Your presentation at the end comes to a defense of expertise. You're an expert. You teach at London Business School. Is or was the argument in this TEDx speech, and indeed in this new book, May Contain Lies, is it in our digital age, is it a defense of experts like yourself?
It's to place more emphasis on the expertise of a person, but it's not to say that experts are always correct. So there can be cases in which experts have biases and they might have made up information in order to get famous. So right now there's this debate about Francesca Gino's work at Harvard Business School. Was that work fabricated and
Yeah,
fraudulent
tell
in
us
order
about
to
that. It's
come
a
up with something
fascinating
like
story. It's full of irony on so many levels.
it is. So she's an extremely famous professor who works in particular on dishonesty. So, how can we prevent people from acting in dishonest ways? And so, there were famous studies finding particular nudges that you could do in order to get people to behave more honestly, be this in things such as reporting your number of miles driven if you're trying to apply for car insurance.
Don't take
But
this personally, Alex, although perhaps you will. But I have to admit, I got a lot of pleasure out of the story, partially because it seems to me as if it's suitable for business school and business school professors. There's so many people like the woman who's been exposed in business schools. You're a business school professor, in fact, an acclaimed one. You're something called the Poets and Quants Professor of the Year, whatever that means. But do you think the business schools are more prone to this kind of nonsense or these kind of lies and self-promoting theories and practices?
well, the phrase I'll use to answer that is professors are people too. And so, just like any person, professors are biased. They might go after fame or whatever gives them popularity or might allow them to get talks and books. So, historically, this might not have been so much of a problem because professors were seen as academics and they only spoke within the academic community. But nowadays, given that if you give a TED talk, you can launch a book about that, there are greater incentives to write what sells and what's popular rather than the truth. And unfortunately, Francesca Gino is not an isolated case. The second most famous TED talk of all time is Amy Cuddy's talk on power poses. And that is the idea that if you're to stand up with your arms outstretched in a victory salute before an interview or a public speech, you'll do better. That evidence has not been replicated by other scientists, yet she was able to launch a book called Presence on the back of it. So I would not be standing here or sitting here and defending my profession. I think my profession is just as amenable and as just as susceptible to misinformation as others. So the fact that somebody calls themselves an expert does not mean that 100% of what they're saying is always true. However, I will still say it is useful to take into account the expertise of somebody because, on average, somebody with expertise is going to be more credible than somebody without, just like you would be more willing to listen to a doctor's diagnosis rather than to self-diagnose on the internet, even though sadly there have been certain doctors who've done some really horrific things.
How do we determine expertise, though? Is it by having a doctorate, an MBA, a university degree, some sort of credible professional acknowledgement by one society or another?
There's lots of different ways of having expertise, and I don't want to be seen as sort of the gatekeeper who decides what is
Well, you
expertise
can
and
be a
what is not.
gatekeeper on this show, Alex. You're allowed to be.
Well,
I'm
let,
your
let me
gatekeeper, and you're the gatekeeper to the rest of the world.
let me give my view then of what I think expertise is. And again, there's different types of expertise. So if you were to have scientific expertise, so this is the ability to say, based on large scale research, companies that practice conscious capitalism deliver higher financial performance. What you'd need is the ability to conduct a large scale study to distinguish correlation from causation. And so something like a PhD in economics or finance and business, and also a track record of publication in the top journals and on that particular topic. That is important. And so the on that particular topic is really key because nowadays you might have any talking head who tries to profess on whatever's hot right now, be this artificial intelligence or diversity, equity, inclusion, irrespective of expertise, they need a track record on that particular topic. But as I mentioned, there's other sources of expertise, and this could be through practitioner knowledge. So, as a CEO or a leading investor, there is nobody better qualified than you to tell, well, how did you take this company to the top? But that is quite different sometimes from making a universal statement across all companies. For example, Ray Dalio, somebody who's come up with principles, and I really respect and have read what he's done. That's something which certainly worked at Bridgewater. But in the absence of evidence, comparing hundreds of companies, some of which adopted his principles and some of which did not, it might be a bit of an overreach to claim that these are universal principles of success
Right, and
and
Ray
that they
Dalio
only work.
himself is a profoundly controversial fellow. We had a guest a few months ago who's written a book, he claims at least, exposing a lot of the self-serving, self-promoting nonsense and lies of Dalio. Your TED speech begins with a story about a woman who has cancer and fights it successfully, and then you expose the fact that she was lying. The argument you seem to suggest in this and perhaps in the book is we believe what we want to believe. Is there some truth to that?
Yeah, so this is the idea of confirmation bias, so that we are much more willing to accept something which accords with our worldview. And so, in the case of the cancer patient, she was able to beat it with clean eating, so she claimed. And so, why does that accord with our worldview? We'd like to believe that the solution to cancer is something natural, not the drugs of large pharmaceutical companies which are used in chemotherapy. Also, we teach our children you can do anything you set your mind to. She was apparently terminal because chemo and radiotherapy didn't work. But the idea that if you just try hard enough, that this can lead to a positive outcome, that's something we just want to believe in. But you asked, Andrew, is this something generally true? I've just given you one anecdote of a case in which it was true. So, this is where large scale evidence can be helpful. And people have done studies where they hook up subjects to an MRI scanner and look at what happens to the brain when you hear stuff that you like and you hear stuff you don't like. So, if you hear stuff you like, this activates the striatum, that's the dopamine rich area of the brain. So, it just makes you feel good, just like the feeling after a good run or a good meal. Whereas if you hear something you don't like, it triggers the amygdala. That's the part of the brain which triggers a fight or flight response, as if you're attacked by a tiger. So, this is why people just want to go into echo chambers. It feels good to hear things that we want to be true, and we don't like a different view. We see this as an attack.
You talk about something, Alex, called a worldview. You suggest that we all have it, and we have this worldview, which in some ways, some things make us comfortable, some don't. Some feel like getting ice cream, others feel like being attacked by a tiger. You talk about making sense of data and rival theories in all this context, but shouldn't we take a step back and address this issue of the worldview, how we get it, and maybe challenge how we get worldviews so that we are not just looking at the world in an attempt to confirm our pre-existing biases?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what's interesting about a worldview is when we think about worldviews, we think, well, these are strong, deep set views on something controversial. So, this might be our worldview on gun control or abortion or immigration. But what is interesting is even subtle things about our worldview can lead to quite significant biases. It could be something as simple as believing natural treatments are better than something artificial, which means we're more predisposed to go for clean eating over chemotherapy or breast milk over bottle feeding, even though the evidence is much more nuanced than what a lot of people claim. And then what is the way of challenging the worldview? It is to look at the other side to see, is there good research which is contradicting our worldview? So in the Brexit referendum in the UK, I was a strong Remainer. I thought the UK should stay within the European Union. But I wanted to see the other side, and I went to talks where people would put the case for Brexit. And I would have loved to believe that Brexiters were uninformed or xenophobic, and I was really surprised to find that many of them had logical arguments. Now, I'm not going to say I completely changed 180 to the opposite direction. I still overall was supporting the UK staying, but I could see that there was some legitimate arguments by the other side of why the UK should perhaps leave. And certainly when the referendum vote came out, I was not one of the people claiming that we should have a revote because I thought this was an actual, a pretty nuanced debate.
I wonder whether your you're dressing up traditional Humean or Lockean skepticism in a 21st century business school language, because what you're really presenting is skepticism, saying that that's healthy and that's the way to approach the world. Are you saying anything different, Alex, from what the Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century argued about science and approaching the world?
It may well not be radically different. And I know lots of authors love to claim I've got something completely radical, which is a paradigm shift. If it was indeed completely radical and a paradigm shift, it may well be wrong. You're implying that for thousands and thousands of years, nobody had come up with your idea. So the idea of challenge yourself, this has been something in the past. Thomas Edison said, I have not failed. I have found 10,000 ways that don't work. Leo Tolstoy says that you can't explain something to an extremely intelligent person if they've decided on their worldview. But if you take somebody who might be less intelligent, they might be more easily teachable if they are just more open to different viewpoints. So the ideas that I have are not completely novel. There have been other people more learned than me who have been highlighting these issues. But what I've tried to do is to apply this to particular data, stories, statistics, evidence that we see in the 21st century, and apply what you might have in philosophy to statistical literacy to trying to understand the data and evidence that we've thrown at us and put this in simple language for a general audience.
In the 18th century, philosophers like Hume were challenging, in many ways, traditional religion and suggesting that religious narratives, which have been told for thousands of years, were wrong, were based on lies or inventions. Is your argument about this sort of, I don't know, what we would call it, a quantifiable skepticism rooted in data? Is it in its own way a challenge to faith, to religion, even if it's maybe not a monotheistic faith, a religious way of thinking about the world?
I'd actually say it's in the other direction. So what is the difference between what I'm talking about and what Hume was talking about is what I'm talking about data. And sometimes people will claim, well, the data here is unambiguous. It doesn't matter what you say and what you argue, this data is rock solid, it is cast iron proof. And what I'm trying to say is even statistics that people present as being rock solid are probably far weaker than they are. So what I'm actually trying to suggest is not using data to drown out all logical argument, but actually when we recognize the limitations of data, that you could have a strong correlation, but it's not causation. Maybe you do have causation, but only in a small specific sample of, say, 40-year-old men in the United States. It doesn't apply to people elsewhere. That's suggesting that we could actually go back to some of the arguments, the qualitative thinking that we had a couple of centuries ago, rather than putting too much faith in the data that we might do right now.
We are speaking with Alex Edmans, the author of May Contain Lies, a really interesting new book about using data to make sense accurately of the world. May Contain Lies, how stories, statistics, and studies exploit our biases and what we can do about it. It's an attempt to make more sense, be more honest about the world. And in this sense, I think he's in the same camp as our friends at Liberties, a quarterly journal of culture and politics, who perhaps in a less quantifiable manner are trying to make sense of the world in their new publication. Going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Alex to talk specifically about the new book. So don't go away, anyone. See you in a second.
News, the noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We are speaking with Alex Edmans from the London Business School, has a new book out, May Contain Lies. Alex, one of the things I like about the book is its subtitle, How Stories, Statistics, and Studies, the 3 S's, exploit our biases and what we can do about it. Your profession, the TED community profession, and indeed many guests on this show fetishize stories. What's wrong with stories, Alex? We've been told that we're all supposed to tell stories all the time. Are you suggesting that the stories we tend to tell ourselves are reflections of our own confirmation bias and we should approach those with a degree of skepticism?
Well, I'll first start by answering what's right with stories. So, why are stories so popular? Because they're vivid, they're appealing, they're much more easy to remember than statistics. And if we go back through history, the oral tradition, that was the way in which we would communicate something to other people in our tribe or something to our children. But the problem with stories is that it could be hand picked examples, they could be the exception that does not prove the rule. For example, if you were to take, say, Simon Sinek's book, he claims that starting with why leads to success. And he gives the story of Apple, which apparently started with why. It said, everything we do, we believe in challenging the status quo. And Apple has become undeniably successful. It was the first company to cross $1 trillion and it's now worth close to $3 trillion. But you don't know whether that was one hand-picked example, which Simon Sinek highlights because it supports his viewpoint. It could well be there's hundreds of other companies that started with why, but because they're basing their business plans on dreams rather than foundations, maybe they end up failing. But because they don't support his idea, this is not in any book or any talk that you will see. And so there's a broader concern, which is the idea of a narrative fallacy, which is when we see some events, we want to weave in a causal chain between them because we want to try to make sense of the world. So we like to have the explanation that Apple was successful because it started with why, or because Steve Jobs was adopted and he wanted to prove himself because he was abandoned by his birth parents. It could be there's hundreds of other explanations for Apple's success. Some of them might not be as appealing. Maybe Steve Jobs worked really hard, or maybe he had a great network of contacts, but because not everybody has a network of contacts, that is not so empowering to the reader. Whereas the idea of starting with why is empowering because anybody can come up with a why if you think hard enough or go in enough brainstorming sessions with enough marker pens and flip charts.
Alex, I wonder if you're giving enough credit to what you called the people on the street, the type of people who read these sorts of books. They know that the fact that Apple started with the word why doesn't mean that every company that starts with why succeeds. That goes without saying. I mean, people aren't that stupid, are they? Even the people on the street. We all have metaphorical ways of dealing with arguments. We know that those kind of arguments should be interpreted creatively. Isn't that true? I mean, no one's making a scientific argument that if you start a company using the word why, you're guaranteed to become a $1 trillion company.
You're right if we are rational. So if we're applying the thinking part of our brain, so what Danny Kahneman calls the system two, we know that this could be a hand-picked anecdote. We know simple things like correlation is not causation. However, when we are irrational because a particular story accords with our biases, we put more weight onto this than we might otherwise think. Now, I'm sure people don't think this is the only thing that drives success. It's neither necessary nor sufficient, but more people will put weight on the importance of a why than is justified by the evidence that Simon Sinek has gathered. And so this is a field in which I work in a lot. I work on purposeful business, sustainable finance, and the amount of times that books like that will be quoted at me as evidence suggests that it has much more influence, even among sophisticated people, than you think should be supported given the strength of the evidence behind it.
You mentioned Daniel Kahneman, one of the co-founders or co-fathers, maybe not founders, of behavioral economics. Is your argument really one in terms of this post-truth world, a way of making sense of it, of getting back to the truth, or at least a truth? Are you borrowing from behavioral economics?
I am actually, yes. And so this is one of the fields that I study myself. So I work in two main fields, sustainable finance and behavioral economics. And so behavioral economics is the idea that even though in the cold light of day, we know how to make decisions, in Kahneman's case, or how to interpret information, in my case, when our bias is at play, then we're not thinking rationally. So Kahneman contrasted system two, which is rational, with system one, which is impulsive, in the context of making decisions and making choices. And I'm trying to apply that to the idea of interpreting information. Yes, we know how to interpret data, not to extrapolate from one story, not to interpret a correlation as causation. But when the story being peddled is something which is appealing, then we forget about our critical thinking and we accept the conclusion which is being paraded.
Isn't your argument one that makes most people uncomfortable? I mean, maybe you wanted to do that, and there's some credit to that, but aren't we all as humans by definition, if we can define our species, we like to tell stories. We are biased. We like to shape the world to our own, what you call worldview. And what you're asking of us is, I don't know what it is. Is it post-human? Is it something that is just for anyone? I mean, even for David Hume, it's a very hard challenge, one that's perhaps post-human.
So it might indeed seem a hard challenge, and I'm not. I won't understate how difficult it is because it goes against what produces dopamine in our brains, and it goes to trying to combat our amygdala. But it also is with the zeitgeist of something which is becoming more popular, which is the importance of diversity. And so diversity to me is not just demographic diversity, but diversity of thought. So challenge what we think to be true, listen to other people, and not just to do this to tick a box, but really hear what they have to say and to see whether there's some truth to that. And through that discernment, we can have become much more informed and have a much richer view of the world than just our one particular set of biases. I will still say that stories do play a role, even despite my concern with them, if indeed you can back up the story with large scale evidence. So as I mentioned, there's lots of benefits of stories, and I start pretty much every chapter of the book with a story. I started my TED talk with a story, the lady who claimed to have cancer. If I just had statistics and regression coefficients, people would fall asleep, nobody would buy the book or watch the talk. We have the story to lean in, so that's a concrete example of what I'm talking about, so they know that it's something real world and not just academic. But then there is research behind it to suggest that the story is not just cherry picked.
Your book comes with lots of good blurbs, although most books seem to these days, from people. Actually, some of them have been on the show. Raghuram Rajan, he's going to be on the show in a couple of weeks. Andy Haldane, Gillian Tedd of the FT, they all love the book. Adam Grant. Is there a model? And I'm always a bit wary of Adam Grant because he seems to blurb most books. He is Mr. Blurb himself. Is there somebody in the 2020s, Alex, for whom you look up to as the person who's a model for this future of what you call diversity, intellectual, ideological diversity, people who are able to negotiate all the propaganda, all the nonsense, all the lies, all the self-promotion?
So I really do look up to Raghu Rajan, and I'm not just saying this in thanks for him blurbing the book, but I was asked to do an interview a few years ago when I won that Poets and Quants award as to who do you really respect, and he's someone I genuinely respect. Why? He comes up with the leading top academic research, but he also applies this to real world problems. And in my profession of being an academic, there are unfortunately some people who think that if you speak to the real world by writing a book or even doing a podcast, then your research must be dumbed down because it's something that ordinary people can understand. I think this is a ridiculous approach to have. It's just like saying to an indie musician, now that you've sold loads of records, you must be too mainstream, you're not true to your indie roots. Why do we do research? It's not just to sit there in a library and be read by academics, but to have real world impact. And Raghu was the governor of the Central Bank of India. He was the chief economist of the IMF. And to do these jobs, there will be lots of different conflicting viewpoints, different views as to whether interest rates should be higher or lower. And to navigate such a difficult job, to use research, but also other people's viewpoints, is a big challenge. And that's why I really respect him.
Yeah, he's coming on. He's got a new book he co-authored on the Indian economy. So I will tell him how much you admire him. Finally, Alex, I wonder whether it's perhaps coincidental that your argument is coming along at the same time as we're, for better or worse, slipping and sliding into the age of AI. How could AI play into the arguments you're making? It seems as if AI could present the architecture, if you like, of a post-truth world, or at least your architecture, your ideal architecture, where we would always have some sort of AI inference. We may already have it with OpenAI or some of the other platforms that are emerging, that will force us to actually test our worldviews, or at least test our biases.
So I think AI could potentially be a solution to misinformation, but also could be a contributor towards misinformation. So how might it be a solution? Well, one of the things that I try to highlight in the book is we shouldn't be skewed too much by one particular study. We want to look at scientific consensus, so what people generally believe. So it may well be that there's a study by Andrew Wakefield claiming that vaccination leads to autism, but the scientific consensus, when you look at lots of other studies, finds that that is not true. And AI, because it will try to look at the general body of knowledge out there, it will hopefully be able to disprove something which is only supported by one or a couple of studies. But on the flip side, people can use AI for nefarious purposes. So we already have a concern that sometimes quotes which were attributed to particular people, be this Albert Einstein or Thomas Edison or Mark Twain, were never actually said by those people. Could it be that people use AI to write something in the style of a particular policymaker or an author and claim that the author or the policymaker said a particular statement when it actually wasn't true, so they could actually be a source of this information as well as a solution to it?
So the post-truth world is not going to get eliminated with AI. It might even compound it.
Unfortunately, so we always think that there's going to be a silver bullet to problems in the world, but whenever you have potential solutions, a lot of solutions will have particular side effects. And until we have much more understanding of AI and how we can avoid problems of using AI to bring up fake news or hallucinations or deep fakes, I think this will be a